Dakota 38 alternate assignment. Essential question: how did the U.S. government wrong the Dakota? Not this again. If you see this, it's time for you to read, and if you see this, it's time for you to write. Reading with purpose. Purpose question: how did the U.S. government wrong the Dakota? The aftermath. That fall, after the U.S.-Dakota War, that is, Colonel Sibley set up a military court to judge the hundreds of Dakota that his men had taken prisoner. He set up this court in the kitchen of one of the Lower Sioux Agency's trading houses. The judges were a panel of Army officers who just days before had fought in the Dakota War. They rushed through dozens of cases each day. The Dakota defendants were often brought to the court, chained together in groups. Like some other military trials of the period, they had no lawyers to present their case. The missionary Stephen Riggs, who had worked for years among the Dakota, was troubled by what he considered a rush to judgment. "I dislike the way the trials were conducted," he wrote. "If the Indians have done wickedness, they should have something like a fair trial, even for our own sake." I learned that the U.S. government wronged the Dakota by Henry Sibley held some of the trials of the accused Dakota in this trader's house at the Lower Sioux Agency. Soldiers guarded these prisoners as they awaited trial. Unlike Riggs, most Minnesotans supported the trials. Outraged by the war, most settlers wanted to see the Dakota punished. Dakota soldiers had killed hundreds of people. Many survivors had been forced to witness the deaths of their friends and families. Most Minnesotans demanded revenge. Newspapers, such as the Faribault Central Republican, expressed it this way: "Extermination, swift, sure, and terrible, is the only thing that can give the people of Minnesota satisfaction or a sense of security." The military court took 39 days to sentence 303 Dakota men to death. The convicted men were marched to a new military camp near Mankato. Bishop Henry Whipple was called straight-tongued by the Dakota because they believed he was honest with them. Under U.S. law, none of those men could be executed or killed without the approval of President Abraham Lincoln. At the urging of Minnesota missionary Henry Whipple, Lincoln's staff reviewed the cases. The more Lincoln learned, the more troubled he felt. In November, he met with Whipple, who described the terrible conditions on the reservations prior to the war, and asked the president to show mercy. In the end, Lincoln approved the execution of 39 Dakota men who had been convicted of crimes against civilians. On the morning of December 26, 1862, in front of a large crowd in Mankato's public square, 38 of the Dakota selected by Lincoln were hanged. One man, Round Wind, or Tadamima, was spared at the last minute. It was the largest mass execution in U.S. history, before or since. President Lincoln ordered the rest of the convicted men to be moved from Mankato to a military prison camp in Iowa called Camp McClellan. While imprisoned there, more than 120 of the nearly 300 Dakota men died as a result of poor conditions. Handwritten on White House stationery, this 3-page document named the 39 Dakota that President Lincoln approved to be executed. Shown here is the first page. Exile. After the war, the U.S. government believed it was not safe for the Dakota to stay in Minnesota. Although many had fled after the war, nearly 2,000 Dakota men, women, and children were in the custody of Sibley's army. The convicted men went to Mankato to be held until their cases were reviewed. The U.S. government decided to force the rest of the Dakota, including many who did not participate in the attacks, to leave their homeland. In their own words, ran with the sound of a rattle. Ran with the sound of a rattle, or Hadayanka, was the son-in-law of Red Banner, a respected Dakota leader. Sentenced to death, he wrote of his frustration at being wrongly accused. I have not killed, wounded, or injured a white man or any white persons. I have not participated in the plunder of their property, and yet today I am set apart for execution and must die in a few days. My wife and my children are dear to me. Let them not grieve for me. Let them remember that the brave should be prepared to meet death, and I will do as becomes a Dakota. About 1,700 Dakota men, women, and children and elders, women, children, and elders were forced to travel just over 100 miles from the Lower Sioux Agency to an internment camp on the riverbanks below Fort Snelling. As the caption says, an internment camp is a place where civilians, prisoners of war, and or political prisoners are held. The march was hard and dangerous. Despite being guarded by U.S. soldiers, the Dakota were attacked by settlers as they passed through the town of Henderson. At least one Dakota child was killed on the march, and several were injured. The 4-mile-long group of wagons, animals, and people arrived at Fort Snelling on November 23, 1862. The conditions at Fort Snelling were difficult. The Dakota were encamped on the riverbanks, surrounded by a wooden wall. They were guarded and fed by U.S. soldiers. At times, they received permission to gather wood and fish outside the camp, but this could be risky. There were many people still angry about the war, and several Dakota were attacked and killed. Measles and other diseases were also spreading that winter. This affected both the Dakota and the many settlers who fled to St. Paul during the war. Overall, between 100 and 200 Dakota died from disease, illness, and attacks during the miserable winter of 1862 to 1863. By early 1863, the U.S. government had canceled all treaties they had signed with the Dakota in Minnesota. The reservation and the annuities were gone. The Dakota would be forced to leave the state. In the spring, those who had survived the winter in the internment camp were exiled. Steamboats, barges, and trains carried more than 1,500 Dakota on rivers and overland to a reservation at Crow Creek in what is now South Dakota. It was a desolate place, and food was scarce. The government sent food, but it was never enough and almost always came late. Hundreds of Dakota died from hunger and disease. An exile is to force to leave one's country or homeland. They were kicked out. About 1,700 Dakota spent the winter of 1862 to 63 at this internment camp below Fort Snelling. Internment camp, again, is a place where civilians, prisoners of war, and or political prisoners are held. The missionary John P. Williamson, who had worked with the Dakota in Minnesota, went to visit. He was appalled by the conditions there. He called Crow Creek a desert and a place that was totally unfit for the habitation of any human being. In 1866, the government finally let the exiled Dakota move to a new reservation in Nebraska. The land was better there than it had been in South Dakota, but it was nothing like home. It was not Minnesota. Dakota exile route. The Dakota started at Fort Snelling in St. Paul and were led down by the Blue Arrows along the Mississippi River and then up the Missouri River to the Crow Creek Reservation. Then they were moved again down to the Santee Reservation in Nebraska. Caption says, after the war, the exiled Dakota were split into two groups. Dakota women, children, and elders were sent to Fort Snelling and then to the Crow Creek Reservation in Dakota Territory in 1863. The convicted Dakota men were first sent to a prison camp in Iowa. Eventually, the men were released from prison and joined their relatives on the reservations. How did the U.S. government wrong the Dakota? The U.S. government wronged the Dakota by and list as many ways as you can think of. There's more than 3. Reading with purpose question. How did things change for the Dakota? A changing landscape. In the summer of 1863, hardly anyone lived in southwestern Minnesota. Nearly all the settlers in the region had abandoned their homes during the war. Most of the Dakota either had fled from the state or been exiled. Only about 200 Dakota who had helped the settlers during the war were allowed to stay. As the years went by, the Dakota remained separated. Many chose to stay on reservations in Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Canada. Many others, however, wanted to return home to Minnesota. Within a few years, some of the Dakota who had been forced to leave their homeland returned to live alongside their relatives who had been allowed to stay in Minnesota. Beginning in the 1880s, these Dakota worked with the U.S. government to establish new communities at the old Upper and Lower Sioux agencies at Prairie Island and at Prior Lake. By the time they established these communities, though, the Dakota could hardly recognize the land they had lived on for generations. It had changed forever. Tens of thousands of new settlers had moved to Minnesota, intent on farming the land in the European American style. I learned that, and here's what changed for the Dakota. So what? Never forget. The outcomes of the U.S.-Dakota War still affect people today. In November 2002, a group of Dakota set out on a march to remember their ancestors. They walked nearly 150 miles from the Lower Sioux Interpretive Center to Fort Snelling to honor the journey their ancestors made in 1862. It took 6 days to make the trip. The 2002 march was the beginning of a tradition. Other similar events have taken place since then. More people participate each year. Dakota educator Gwen Westerman has participated in this event multiple times over the years. She explains, "This is a ceremony. It's not a protest. It's not a reenactment. It's a spiritual ceremony for healing and honoring those women and children we descend from. We remember their strength and their determination." Have you ever participated in an event to remember and honor the past? What was the experience like for you? I learned that, and here's what changed for the Dakota. How did things change for the Dakota? Here's what changed for the Dakota, and. That was tough history. How are you feeling about it? I feel, if you could do something to make things right, what would you do? I would. All done? Phew, that was a long one. You are a grade A champ. Please drop box at MNS Dakota 38 alternate assignment.